the silent woods of the Appalachians, a lone German shepherd began appearing near a remote cabin. Never barking, never begging, just watching. The woman inside, a former war reporter hiding from her past, saw something in his eyes. Not wildness, but memory. She left food at the edge of the clearing. He took it, then vanished, until one morning he returned dragging a half-frozen puppy through the snow, not for himself, for someone else. That's when everything began. If you believe some animals remember, and loyalty can survive even Firewatch till the end. And if it stays with you, like, subscribe, and tell us where you're watching from. This story deserves to be felt, not just seen. The first morning frost always settled thickest in early December. The edges of the pine trees wore halos of white, and the air hummed with the sound of nothingness. No traffic, no chatter, no clicks of cameras or breaking news. Just wind and trees, and Amara Lewis still waking from another restless night. She stood on the wooden porch of her small cabin, tucked into the foothills of the Appalachian wilderness. Her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug, steam curling from it like a second breath. The coffee was bitter just the way she liked it. Out here, bitterness didn't need sugar. 3 years had passed since Amara left her life as a war correspondent behind. Or maybe the right word was fled. After the ambush in the Congo, after the screams, after the heat and red sand and the sound of barking dogs mixed with gunfire, she'd vanished into a self-imposed exile, retreating to the only inheritance her grandmother had left. A run-down, moss-kissed cabin 2 hours from the nearest town, surrounded by 20 acres of wilderness that didn't care who she had once been. The silence here was not comfort but armor. Nothing could reach her if nothing could find her. She sipped the coffee and glanced toward the tree line, just beyond the clearing where early winter light filtered through the trees like pale gold. That's when she saw him. Again, the dog. He was half-shepherd, large, lean fur, a deep burnished black with streaks of rust brown across his shoulders and legs. He wasn't a stray. Not in the traditional sense. His posture was too sharp, his eyes too focused. But his ribs showed. His left hind leg carried a subtle limp, and a streak of mud caked the right side of his face. He was watching her. Not begging, not creeping, just watching. Amara froze. Her heart beat in that low, angry rhythm it always did when memory tried to claw up her throat. 3 years ago, she had been surrounded by a pack of guard dogs in a warlord's camp. One of them had lunged at her, jaws flashing in the firelight, and even now the scars on her side tightened with the cold. She couldn't trust dogs. She didn't hate them. She feared them. Feared what they triggered in her. Feared how powerless she became around them. But this one didn't snarl, didn't step forward, just sat 10 feet from the edge of the clearing, eyes pinned on her cabin like a soldier on watch. She whispered to herself, "What the hell are you doing out here again?" This was the 4th morning in a row he'd appeared. Always around the same time, always alone, always sitting at the edge of the tree line. Something about the precision of his posture, the stillness, it unsettled her more than if he had barked or charged. Dogs didn't behave like that unless trained. But what kind of trained dog limped through the forest alone? The shepherd's ears twitched. Then, without a sound, he stood, turned, and disappeared into the woods. That night, Amara didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at her desk, flipping through her old field notes she hadn't touched in years, trying to ignore the flicker of heat in her chest. Curiosity. That old, dangerous thing. The same thing that got her embedded with guerrilla fighters and smuggled across borders and nearly killed in Sudan. The next morning, she left out a small piece of chicken on a flat stone near the porch, half convinced a raccoon would get to it first. But when she returned hours later, the meat was gone. The stone was clean, no scratch marks, no feathers, no mess. But beside the stone, just 5 feet away, a single paw print in the frost. Deep, deliberate. The shepherd had come and taken the offering. Over the next few days, it became a pattern. Amara would leave a small portion, nothing too generous, just enough, and it would be gone by morning. Once she stayed up late enough to catch a glimpse, the dog stepping out from the woods like a specter, retrieving the meat and vanishing just as fast. He never came close, never looked toward her window. But Amara noticed something strange. One morning, she left the chicken too close to the porch, maybe 4 feet from the stairs. And it was untouched. The following day, she placed it 10 feet away, back near the edge of the clearing. It disappeared by dawn. He was watching, measuring. He had boundaries. Then, the twist. On the 6th day, just after sunrise, Amara noticed a change. The meat was gone as usual, but this time, something else was missing. A piece of the firewood pile had been nudged out of place. A cloth bag of trail mix she'd left under the porch, completely untouched by animals for weeks, had vanished. She crouched down, and that's when she saw it. The tracks down, just one larger, one smaller. The big shepherd hadn't come alone. Amara's breath caught. She looked into the trees, cold slicing into her lungs. The shepherd wasn't eating for himself. He was feeding someone else. A pup? She swallowed hard. Something inside her, something buried beneath years of self-preservation and cynicism and barbed wire thought, cracked open. He's not a stray, she thought. He's a guardian. And for the first time since the Congo, Amara didn't feel fear when thinking of a dog. She felt something else, wonder, and something dangerously close to trust. The 7th morning arrived, coated in silver frost, the kind that shimmered like broken glass beneath a pale blue sky. Amara stood on the porch again, watching the clearing where she'd last seen him, the big dog with the steady eyes and limping gait. But today he didn't come. The meat lay untouched. The woods beyond were silent still. Something in her chest shifted, an unexpected flicker of disappointment. She wrapped her scarf tighter around her neck, trying to shake the irrational concern growing in her stomach. He was a stray, she told herself, a wild animal. Not a pet, not a friend, not a promise. Just as she was turning to head inside, a flash of color near the tree line stopped her cold. It was him, Bruno. He stood further back than usual, just beyond the first curtain of pine, partially hidden in shadow. His head was lowered, his eyes locked on hers. The moment held for what felt like an eternity. Then he stepped forward, slow, deliberate. The movement made Amara's breath catch. She noticed something today she hadn't seen before, not clearly. On his left side, just above the flank, a thick, jagged scar carved through the fur, the kind that didn't come from barbed wire or a tumble in the wood. No, this was a wound with purpose. Clean, brutal, burned at the edges. Gunshot. And not just any shot. Amara had seen enough battlefield wounds in both humans and canines to know this was trauma by design. High velocity, close range, the kind that ended lives. Her hands tightened around the mug she was holding, the heat suddenly unfamiliar. That dog had been in combat. Later that afternoon, she returned to her desk and pulled out the old tablet she rarely used. She opened a browser and typed in keywords. Missing canine units, German Shepherd, combat dogs retired, and explosion scars on canine flank. It was a long shot, but instincts didn't fade even after 3 years away from war zones. They just changed targets. Hours passed in quiet obsession. The only sounds, the clicks of her fingers and the occasional caw of a raven outside. And then, an article buried deep in a military newsletter archive. Federal canine missing in action. Operation Burnhold. Her breath hitched. Bruno's photo was there, grainy but unmistakable. Same posture, same coat, same eyes, same scar. The article was brief and sanitized. A federal canine lost during a classified hostage extraction mission in a warehouse explosion outside of New York. No remains found. Declared deceased. But the date, 2 years ago, which meant he'd been out there, alone, surviving in silence all this time. The weight of that realization sunk heavy into her ribs. She whispered aloud, "You're not just a stray. You're a ghost they left behind." That night, the storm came. Wind tore through the trees like invisible hands, shaking the windows, pushing snow sideways in hard white sheets. Amara lit the wood stove and stayed wrapped in a thick quilt, the old war inside her mind clawing to come out. Every gust sounded like gunfire, every howl of wind like screaming. And then, through it all, a sound that didn't belong to the storm. 3 short barks. Pause. 2 longer ones. Then silence. Then again. 3 short, 2 long. Short. Amara froze. She knew that rhythm. Her brain kicked into a part of itself she hadn't used in years. Foreign correspondents embedded with military teams had to know basic Morse sequences for emergency signaling. And this was a call for alert, Danger. Threat. Help. She scrambled for her coat and flashlight and ran to the porch, nearly slipping on the ice-slicked boards. The wind whipped at her hair, blinding her with snow. But then she saw Bruno standing just past the edge of the woods, facing not her but the other side of the tree line. His stance was tense, head low, tail rigid. He barked again, same sequence. 3, 2, 1. Jesus, Amara breathed. She stepped off the porch and followed his gaze. For a second, all she saw was trees, but then a glint of something metallic, moving between trunks. Too tall for an animal, too slow to be wind. A man? She ducked instinctively behind the porch's outer wall, heart thundering in her chest. What the hell was happening? Bruno didn't move toward her. He stayed in place, guarding. Amara scanned the snow and spotted faint boot prints fresh leading into her property from the far slope. Whoever had been there had come close. Too close, and Bruno had signaled her the only way he knew how. Back inside, Amara locked every door and window. She watched from the living room as Bruno circled the cabin once, sniffing at the perimeter before disappearing back into the woods. Not afraid, not fleeing, but patrolling. He was protecting her. She sat on the edge of her couch, adrenaline still fizzing under her skin, and whispered to the empty room, "Who trained you like that?" No dog learned Morse naturally. This wasn't a trick, it wasn't a coincidence. This was strategy. Bruno hadn't just survived, he had remembered. Somewhere deep in his bones, the discipline hadn't faded. The loyalty hadn't dimmed. Someone had molded him into a soldier, and someone had left him behind. That scar wasn't just a mark of survival, it was a story no one had written down. Until now, Amara pulled out a weathered notebook and started writing. Not for publication, not yet, but for memory. For him. Outside, the wind calmed. The snow fell softer. The forest whispered secrets only the wounded could hear. Somewhere in the trees, Bruno waited, and Amara listened. Then just before dawn, she heard it again. Different this time. A shorter signal, one she hadn't heard since Kandahar. One short bark, one long, then silence. She froze. That meant the storm hit harder than the forecast warned. By midnight, the cabin groaned under the weight of wind-choked snow, and the power had flickered 3 times before giving out entirely. Amara lit the old kerosene lamp, the soft golden glow casting long, shivering shadows on the cabin walls. Her breath fogged with every exhale, and the silence outside had taken on a sinister edge, like something vast was holding its breath. She hadn't seen Bruno for 2 days. Not since the night he barked the last Morse warning, short, long, then vanished into the darkness without a trace. Part of her wanted to believe he had gone deeper into the forest, found shelter, maybe even safety. But a colder part, the part that remembered watching men vanish into smoke and never return, whispered a harsher truth. Storms like this didn't just test survival, they erased. Amara lay curled on the couch, wrapped in layers of blankets, her boots still on, the fire struggling against the cold that slipped through every crack of the old wood. Outside, the wind screamed down the mountainside and the trees beat against each other with the violence of war. She tried to sleep but couldn't. Her ears strained past every groan of the cabin, past the popping of the firewood, searching for something, anything. Just after 3:00 a.m., it came. A sound, not the storm, a scratching subtle, deliberate at the front door. Amara bolted upright. Her heart slammed once, twice, and then she moved. She grabbed the flashlight and her grandfather's rusted shotgun, not even sure it worked anymore, and crept to the door. Her breath shallow. She hesitated, every instinct screamed at her not to open it, not tonight, not now. But another voice, quieter but heavier, said his name, Bruno. She unlatched the bolt and cracked the door just an inch. What she saw made her knees buckle. There he was, drenched and shaking, fur clumped with snow and ice, standing just past the threshold like a statue carved from exhaustion and pain. His eyes locked with her, same steady stare, but this time, it wasn't silent. It was pleading. Through the windows his knees fluttered. Was something small, a bundle of trembling gray fur matted with blood and slush, paws dangling lifelessly, one twisted at a brutal angle. A puppy. Amara dropped the flashlight. Jesus, she whispered, pulling the door open wide. Bruno didn't move at first. His legs trembled violently, and then, with a soft grunt, he stepped forward, crossing into the cabin with slow, mechanical movements, as if his body had gone far past its limits. Amara cleared space by the fire, spreading out towels, and Bruno lay the pup down with the same care she'd seen a mother give her newborn in a war tent. Then he backed away, collapsed against the front door, and didn't move again. The puppy wasn't moving either, aside from shallow breaths that puffed and collapsed in uneven rhythm. Momara reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched the pup's fur. It was ice cold. She wrapped it in the warmest towel she had, placed a hot water bottle gently against its side, and whispered softly to it like she had to the children in the refugee clinic. "Stay with me, little one." As dawn cracked gray against the windows, the snow still hammered down, but the winds had begun to wane. Bruno hadn't eaten, hadn't moved, but his eyes never left the bundle by the fire. They tracked every twitch, every breath. Amara sat beside him and, for the first time, placed her hand on his shoulder. He didn't flinch. He leaned. Later that morning, with the storm slowing just enough to make a desperate trip possible, she loaded the puppy into a box lined with blankets and placed it gently in the back seat of her Jeep. Bruno didn't need an invitation. He jumped into the passenger seat and curled tightly, watching over his small cargo the entire way. The drive to the animal clinic was 3 hours of treacherous, half-cleared roads and ice-slicked bends. But Amara didn't hesitate. Something deeper than instinct had taken over now. This wasn't just rescue. This was reparation. Dr. Lena Morel was the only vet who answered Amara's call. When they arrived, she ushered them in with urgency, eyes narrowing at the sight of the pup's condition. "Severe hypothermia," she muttered. "Compound fracture here, and look at this old bruising around the abdomen. Some ribs? This pup's been abused." Amara's jaw tightened. "Can you save him?" "You'll try, but he's small, maybe 3 months, and he's already lost a lot." While the vet worked, Amara waited in the corner of the room with Bruno lying at her feet like a sentry. On a whim, she asked Dr. Morel to scan the pup for a chip. The machine beeped. There was one. The data pulled up was old, fragmented, and encrypted. Not the kind of registration you'd expect from a family pet. No address, just a code. 3 letters, 2 numbers. Amara froze when she saw them. Those exact prefixes had come up before, years ago, in a case she had worked undercover, one that had cost her her position, her funding, and nearly her life. A case about an illegal dogfighting ring operating under the guise of a breeding program for protection dogs, a front protected by men with influence, money, and political ties. She had tried to expose it, but the footage she gathered disappeared. Her contacts vanished, and one night someone had broken into her apartment and left a warning carved into the wall. She never talked about that case again, but now, that scar was back, and it was breathing at her feet. Amara stood slowly and walked toward the operating room's window. Bruno was there beside her, tail curled, eyes tired but burning. She whispered, "You didn't just find him. You went back for him." Her voice cracked. "You brought him to the only person who tried to stop them once." Bruno didn't move. He didn't need to. Amara had seen enough war to know when someone was asking for help without words. The pup, barely alive, wasn't just a victim. He was evidence. And the people who hurt him, they hadn't finished yet. The blizzard returned without warning. One moment the sky was pale and brittle with winter sun, and the next it collapsed into a white wall of silence and rage. The vet clinic had insisted on keeping the puppy, now barely stabilized, under 24-hour observation. And while Bruno refused to leave the lobby, Amara made the mistake of insisting she would drive back to the cabin that night to gather more supplies, food, and documentation tied to the old case. She had left in late afternoon, hoping to beat the worst of the snow, but she was barely halfway up the mountain road when visibility dropped to near zero, and her Jeep spun off the path into a shallow embankment surrounded by trees. The vehicle stalled, the engine gave one final cough, and everything went still except for the hiss of snow swallowing the world outside. The temperature had already begun to drop, and the wind howled like it had teeth. Marala tried restarting the engine once, twice, but the battery had nothing left to give. Her gloves were thin. Her parka, though insulated, was already damp from melted snow seeping in at the seams. Panic clawed at her throat, but she shoved it down with the same force she used to walk through gunfire in Aleppo. She grabbed the flashlight, shoved open the door against the piling snow, and started walking. She couldn't stay in the vehicle, she'd freeze before morning. Her cabin was less than 2 miles away. She could make it. But she didn't. After less than half a mile, her legs buckled. Her vision blurred at the edges. The cold wasn't biting anymore. It was a blanket. Seductive. Soft. Her knees hit the snow hard and the flashlight tumbled from her hand, rolling into darkness. Somewhere in the haze of her fading thoughts, she heard a bark. Then another. Sharp, insistent. Her body didn't move. She was sliding into unconsciousness the way someone might fall asleep in a warm bath. Quiet, slow, final. But the cold didn't take her. She woke to pressure, weight on her chest, heat against her cheek. Something was breathing next to her face. Snow had been packed around her like a nest, layer after layer of powder and pine boughs and damp earth. And nestled between her arms, wrapped tightly against her coat, was the puppy, still weak but alive. And above them, curled into a protective arc like a living wall, was Bruno. He had found her, dug her out of the drift, dragged the pup to her side, and buried them both under snow to preserve their heat. He had kept her alive. She blinked slowly, lips cracked, eyes burning from the cold. Bruno was watching her, eyes alert but unafraid. He didn't bark, didn't move, just stayed, his body forming a barrier against the wind. She didn't remember crawling back to the cabin, only that she woke again on the living room floor near the fireplace, wrapped in sleeping bags and fur, with Bruno lying beside her and the puppy tucked against her chest like a second heartbeat. 2 days later, once the roads cleared enough to return to the clinic, Dr. Morrill confirmed what Amara had feared. The puppy's condition was improving slowly, but the scan from the embedded chip had finally yielded a full traceable IP, and it was worse than Amara had imagined. The code matched a registry only known to federal agents investigating underground breeding and fighting operations. A black site disguised as a training center. The chip had been registered under a holding facility in South Carolina, but that facility no longer existed because it had been torched, burned to the ground. No survivors, or so they thought. Amara stared at the printout in silence, her hand trembling slightly as she read the date on the report. It was a date she knew too well. She had been there, that same week, undercover. She had slipped through the back fence under moonlight, filming with a body cam stitched into her coat. She remembered the rows of cages stacked on top of each other, the smell of waste and blood, the men laughing as they struck a muzzle against a concrete wall to make a puppy bark on command. And then the fire. A sudden explosion from the west end of the lot. She had barely escaped with her life, her footage destroyed in the chaos, her identity exposed. It was the last time she ever trusted a source without vetting 3 ways over. The investigation was shut down quietly. The lead handler arrested for unrelated charges. No official ties to anyone higher. And she had been told firmly to drop it or face corruption. They framed it as a safety issue. What they meant was political. Powerful hands had been at work, and now, years later, one of the only living survivors of that night had landed in her arms. Bruno had known where to find him, had risked everything to bring him back. But why? Why now? The question burned in her skull. She ran her hands through her hair, pacing the edge of the clinic waiting room, her boots scuffing at the tile. Bruno sat nearby, silent, alert, watching the hallway, the way he had carried the pup, the way he had guarded it. That wasn't coincidence, that was purpose, that was mission. Dr. Morrill stepped out from the back with a chart in hand. "There's something else," she said quietly. "The scar on the pup's neck, it's a healed puncture wound, but not from a fight. From a syringe. My guess is he was tagged for destruction and somehow got loose. So he was marked for death," Amara murmured. "And someone went back for him," the doctor added, eyes glancing toward Bruno. Amara stared at the shepherd's heart hammer. "He didn't just stumble across that pup." Dr. Morrill nodded. "No, he saved him." The words landed heavy, like a stone thrown into still water, rippling outward through everything Amara thought she knew. She walked out of the clinic and leaned against the Jeep, snow still dusting the hood from earlier that morning. Bruno followed, stopping beside her, gaze fixed on the street beyond. She knelt beside him, her voice low. "You brought him to me. Not to any vet, not to any town. You walked into a blizzard and brought him to the one person who was there, Who saw it? Who tried to stop it? Bruno looked at her. For the first time, Amara felt the weight of that look. It wasn't a dog looking at a human. It was a soldier calling in backup, and the war they had both tried to leave behind hadn't ended. The snow had stopped falling days ago, but the cold lingered like a second skin. Sharp, unforgiving. Amara had brought the puppy, now officially under temporary care, back to her cabin with explicit approval from Dr. Morrill, who deemed him stable enough for home recovery under close supervision. The pup, whom she'd started calling Ace without even realizing it, was healing slowly. His ribs showed less each day, and though his injured leg was still splinted and weak, he had begun hobbling after Bruno around the house like a silent shadow. Bruno, in turn, had accepted the new role without hesitation. He slept between Ace and the fireplace every night, positioning himself so his back faced the door, and his eyes could track every sound from outside. Amara had learned to trust that look, that stillness, that tension in his body like a wire stretched tight across time. It started with the footprints. 3 mornings in a row, Amara found them circling the perimeter of her cabin. Heavy, deliberate boot prints, not hers. Not from hikers. The first set she found along the east tree line near the edge of the frozen creek. The second appeared near the back of the cabin, just below the window where she kept her files locked in a weatherproof cabinet. The third set stopped at the porch steps and turned away. No trespasser, no break-in, just observation. But they were fresh and recent. She didn't mention it at first, not even to herself. She brushed it off as coincidence, as her own nerves catching up with her. The mountain attracted lost hikers sometimes, and she had made enemies before. But deep down, she knew it wasn't random, especially not after the last storm had erased all previous tracks. These were new. They were watching. She stopped sleeping properly after that. Nights became hours of half-lucid listening, with her breath held tight in her throat and one hand always resting near the drawer where she kept her father's old revolver. She started checking the locks twice, then 3 times. Then she wired a simple alarm from an old motion sensor camera and attached it to a string of bells hanging over the cabin's front door, just in case. But that wouldn't stop what came next. On the 5th night, Bruno refused to lie down. He paced the cabin like a soldier on patrol, his claws clicking softly against the wood floors as the wind howled just beyond the glass. Amara sat in the armchair by the window, a blanket draped over her legs, one eye on her notes, one on Bruno. Ace slept in his crate beside the hearth, his tiny chest rising and falling in quiet rhythm. Around 2:13 a.m., the bells chimed once. Just once. No wind, no draft. Amara froze. Bruno did not bark. He moved. With terrifying speed and silence, he crossed to the front door and stopped, ears forward, body low. Amara followed, heart thudding in her ears. She reached for the revolver and whispered, "Stay," to Ace, though she knew the pup couldn't move much even if he tried. She flipped off the lamp, leaving the cabin in near absence. There was someone outside. Not a bear, not a hiker. A man. She could hear his breath slow, measured just beyond the porch. Then a faint click, like metal against wood. Her hand tightened on the doorframe. Through the window's edge, she caught a glimpse of a silhouette. Black clothing, gloves. A face half covered in a scarf, and something long and metallic slung over his shoulder. Not a rifle, a tranquilizer gun. Her stomach dropped. This wasn't random, they had come for Ace. Before she could react, Bruno did. He lunged. With a crack of wood and the explosion of motion, he burst through the side door one Amara had forgotten to bolt. The intruder turned just in time to raise the tranquilizer rifle, but he was too late. Bruno's weight hit him mid-chest, slamming him into the snow-packed ground with the force of a boulder. A sharp yelp made us in to push the door open. The man thrashed, trying to reach for his weapon, but Bruno sank his teeth into the man's wrist with a growl so deep it rattled the air. Amara ran out barefoot, snow biting at her skin, gun raised. "Let him go," she shouted, and Bruno obeyed instantly, retreating 2 paces, still growling. The man scrambled back, leaving the rifle behind, clutching his bleeding wrist. He muttered something low and furious, something about a damned federal bitch and unfinished business, and then vanished into the tree line before she could stop him. Amara stood in the cold, breath visible, gun trembling in her grip. Brûlé returned to her side, chest heaving, his eyes still burning with focus. She picked up the dropped rifle and stared at it under the porch light. It was standard issue. Government grade, no serial, clean work, hired hand. Her hands shook harder than the cold could explain. She looked at Bruno, then at the trail of blood disappearing into the woods. This wasn't just about the past anymore. They knew Ace was alive, and they were afraid of what he remembered, or worse, what Amara might uncover if she started asking questions again. The kind of questions she had been warned not to ask all those years ago. She ushered Bruno inside, secured every lock in the cabin, and stayed awake until morning, listening to every creak in the floor, every shift in the wind. Ace didn't wake once, but when the sun finally rose, lighting the forest in fractured gold, she found him standing inside his crate, legs wobbling, eyes fixed on the front door, not afraid, waiting. By the time the bruises beneath Ace's fur faded and the stiffness in his leg began to ease, the snow outside had begun to thaw. The thick blanket that had once buried the mountains started to crack and melt, revealing brown needles and damp earth underneath. The forest was breathing again. Life was waking up, but inside the cabin, something far more unexpected had begun to grow, an unspoken dynamic, a rhythm between the two dogs that made Amara feel like a spectator to something older than language. Ace no longer whimpered in his sleep. He no longer trembled when she approached. But he didn't seek her out either. While he accepted her presence, her food, her voice, his eyes always flicked first to Bruno before doing anything else. If Bruno stood, Ace followed. If Bruno sat, Ace mimicked. If Bruno growled low at a strange noise outside, Ace's hackles would raise, even if he didn't understand why. It was like watching a child imprint on a mentor, not for comfort, but for purpose. And Bruno accepted the role without resistance. He didn't coddle, he didn't play. What he offered was something different: structure, discipline, survival. It started the first time Ace wandered too close to the edge of the porch. His limp had improved, and he could now walk without dragging the leg. But that morning, when he padded toward the woods without hesitation, Bruno intercepted him before Amara could move. He didn't bark, he didn't bite. He stood in front of the pup, body rigid, and let out a single, sharp huff. Ace froze, ears back. Then he backed away, and from the window, Amara watched it all unfold like a dance she didn't know the steps to. Later that day, Bruno led Ace around the cabin in slow circles, stopping every few feet to sniff at specific spots: the firewood pile, the crate near the shed, the base of the back door. Ace followed, mimicking each pause, each sniff. Amara realized what she was watching wasn't random. It was training. Over the following days, the pattern became clear. Bruno would take Ace out at sunrise and sunset, always for 10 to 15 minutes at a time. He taught him to move silently across the snow, to crouch low when birds scattered, to freeze when deer passed through the clearing. He showed him how to wait, how to listen. Once, Amara dropped a tin cup inside the cabin and both dogs froze at the sound. But Ace glanced at Bruno first before reacting. The older dog didn't move. Neither did Ace. It wasn't just obedience, it was hierarchy. And Bruno enforced it with a calm, relentless authority that Amara hadn't seen outside military training grounds. She had embedded with SEALs. She had filmed joint operations with NATO handlers. What she saw now on her own porch mirrored those exact routines. Each movement Bruno made was intentional, each correction minimal but firm. He never repeated himself. Ace learned fast. Amara started documenting it, first out of habit, then out of necessity. She filmed from her phone, not for broadcast but for evidence. The coordination, the memory, the silent cues, none of this came from instinct alone. These were protocols, tactics. Bruno was rebuilding Ace's instincts from the ground up, restoring something the trauma had shattered, and perhaps more importantly, he was giving him rules. Not commands from a human, rules from within. The most shocking moment came on a fog-drenched morning near the end of March. Amara had taken them both outside early, coffee in one hand, notes in the other. She wandered down to the small stream that cut across the southern edge of her land. While she knelt to test the ice near the water's edge, she didn't notice the small silver compass fall from her pocket. It was a family heirloom, carried with her through war zones and sleepless nights. Hours later, back inside, she realized it was gone. Before she could panic, Bruno stood, turned to Ace, and barked once. Then he sniffed Amara's coat, walked to the door, and looked back. She followed them both. Bruno led Ace in looping patterns through the woods behind the cabin. 10 minutes in, Bruno stopped and stepped aside. Ace sniffed the ground, circled twice, then suddenly lunged into a patch of brittle grass and returned with something in his mouth. The compass. Amara was stunned. This wasn't chance. This was a retrieval drill. Bruno had remembered, and Ace had performed. Later that evening, as the fire crackled low and the air inside the cabin settled into its quiet hush, Amara opened her laptop and began cross-referencing old K9 unit manuals with the behaviors she had observed over the past week. She matched 3 specific patterns: low-level tracking, controlled perimeter circling, and scent identification. All 3 matched federal K9 curriculum specifically, retired code-level routines used by dogs assigned to high-risk recovery and protection assignments. This wasn't just mentorship. This was operational transfer. Bruno wasn't only protecting Ace, he was preparing him. But for what? Amara found herself watching Ace differently after that. He no longer resembled the broken thing she had pulled from Bruno's back during the blizzard. His coat had grown fuller, his gait more confident. He still carried the limp, but he compensated with grace. And when he walked, it was no longer with fear, it was with intention. He began sleeping closer to the door. He responded to noises first, and though Amara had never spoken a word of command to him, she once muttered "leave it" when he went for a sock under the couch, and he obeyed. He had been trained before, or was being trained now. Either way, the past was surfacing, and Bruno was at the center of it. One night, Amara sat on the porch while the dogs moved through the yard in silence, circling the tree line like ghosts. The moon cast long shadows over the melting snow, and the scent of pine was thick in the air. She sipped her coffee, then whispered into the dark, "You're not just teaching him how to survive, are you?" Bruno turned at the sound of her voice. His eyes found hers across the clearing. Then he returned to the trees, Ace at his heels. The morning was too quiet. That was the first thing Amara noticed as she opened the front door with a steaming mug of coffee in hand, expecting to find Bruno standing watch by the woodpile like he always did. Back straight, eyes sweeping the perimeter with the solemnity of a sentry. But the space where he usually stood was empty. The snow had melted enough in the past few days to leave patches of wet earth, dark and soft beneath her boots. But there were no fresh prints, no marks of pacing, no bark, no thud of his paws against the porch as he shifted positions. She set her mug down slowly, her stomach tightening. "Bruno," she called once, twice, voice rising just slightly above normal. No answer. Ace poked his head from around the edge of the cabin, ears perked, expression alert but confused. He turned a circle in the grass, sniffed the air, then looked back at Amara as if asking what to do. She walked to the edge of the porch and scanned the clearing. There, just beyond the rhododendron line, something red caught her eye. She dropped to her knees. It was blood. Not much, but unmistakable. A spatter no larger than her palm, still wet, soaking into the mud like spilled ink. Nearby, a paw print. Large, deep, dragging. "Bruner!" Amara didn't hesitate. She sprinted back inside, grabbed her jacket, flashlight, revolver, and a roll of gauze she kept in the emergency drawer. Ace was already pacing near the door, whimpering in short, anxious bursts. As soon as she stepped outside, he bolted forward, not into the woods, but along the edge, following something she couldn't see. She followed, heart pounding, every footfall crunching through damp leaves and patches of lace. The trail was erratic, small smears of blood here and there, almost hidden. No human footprints, just that dragging mark, uneven and slow. Whoever had come for him had come quietly, had left just as silently. But Bruno hadn't gone without resistance. After 20 minutes of weaving through underbrush, Ace slowed. His nose was close to the ground, tail stiff, head turning sharply every few steps. Amara's breath came in ragged bursts. The trees closed in tighter here, and the light filtering through the branches took on a gray-green hue, casting everything in a muted gloom. Then Ace stopped. His whole body froze. A low growl bubbled in his... Amara came up behind him, scanning the thicket, and then she saw it. A shape, barely visible, lying between two moss-covered boulders. Bruna. He was on his side, chest rising in shallow, rapid pulses. One front leg twisted unnaturally beneath him, muzzle streaked with blood. His back leg jerked once, then stilled. Amara dropped beside him, her hands already reaching out, her voice catching in her throat. Bruno? Oh God. He blinked slowly. His eyes found her. One ear twitched. That was all. She scanned his body and found the wound high on his left shoulder, where fur had been torn away in a perfect, rapid rhythm. No exit wound. A single point of impact. A sniper round. Ace stood close, nose pressed against Bruno's side, whining softly, nuzzling the fur as if trying to nudge him awake. Amara pulled the gauze from her coat pocket and pressed it gently to the wound, even though she knew it would do little. The bleeding had slowed. That was never a good sign. Bruno's body was too still, too cold. She needed help. She needed to get him to the vet. But she was nearly 2 miles from the cabin, and the trail was uneven. Carrying him alone wouldn't be possible. Her mind raced. She pulled out her phone, no signal. Then she heard it. A soft metallic clink against rock. She turned sharply, eyes scanning the ridge above. Nothing. Just wind and the creak of a branch. But she knew that sound. The click of a bolt sliding back, the adjustment of a scope. Someone had been watching. Someone still was. She ducked instinctively and pulled Ace close, shielding both dogs with her body as best she could. For a moment, everything went still. Bruno stirred beneath her hand, his breathing a ragged rasp now. Eyes fluttering still. Filter nose, she whispered softly. Hold on. I'm not leaving you. When the forest offered no more signs of threat, she stood. No footsteps, no voices. Whoever it was had fired once and vanished. Back at the cabin hours later, Dr. Morrill arrived in a 4-wheeler she borrowed from a ranger outpost after receiving Amara's panicked emergency transmissions sent from a nearby elevation point. Together they carried Bruno back, swaddled in blankets, Ace following close behind with unwavering focus. The vet examined the wound under floodlight in the kitchen, her gloved fingers moving with clinical precision. This isn't from a hunter's rifle, she said quietly. Too clean. It's not hollow point, not scatter. This is military grade. Something you use when you want one shot to drop a target. Fast, silent, no mess. Amara didn't speak. She didn't need to. They both understood what this meant. Someone wanted Bruno out of the picture, permanently. And if they were willing to use a suppressed round with specialized ammo on a retired canine, they weren't just sending a message. They were cleaning up loose ends. Ace stayed beside Bruno all night, resting his head on the older dog's paw, eyes open, breathing in. Not once did he leave the room, and when Bruno whimpered in his sleep, Ace would whine softly in return, pressing closer. Amara watched them from the corner, knees drawn to her chest, the revolver within arm's reach. She didn't sleep. Not when ghosts were walking the woods. Not when the most loyal creature she had ever known lay broken in the heart of her home. The following morning broke gray and sluggish, the sky low and heavy with unshed rain, as if nature itself was holding back something it couldn't yet release. Bruno lay wrapped in wool blankets near the fire, his breathing shallow but steady, eyes fluttering in restless sleep. Dr. Morrill had administered fluids and a mild sedative, cleaned the wound as best she could, and extracted the round lodged deep in his shoulder. It was a 6.5-inch Creedmoor military sniping caliber, subsonic. No hunting round, no accident. This was tactical, a shot meant to eliminate a threat without alerting the forest. Bruno had survived by inches, and whoever pulled the trigger had vanished without a trace. Erdmora sat at the dining table, hunched over her laptop with a half-drunk mug of cold coffee beside her, Ace curled at her feet like a sentinel. The events of the past 72 hours had burned away the last layer of silence she had built around herself. She no longer had the luxury of pretending this wasn't bigger than her, bigger than one dog or one memory. She pulled up encrypted files from her old field investigation drive, photos and reports she hadn't looked at in nearly 4 years. The last time she'd tried to publish anything related to the New Corinth Kennel compound, Her credentials had been suspended, her articles blocked, and her name quietly blacklisted from 3 major outlets. They said she fabricated sources, that her footage was inconclusive, that the arson, which killed at least 20 canines and allegedly burned every record on site, had been the work of activists. Wild speculation at best, internal sabotage at worst, but none of it sat right. Not then, and certainly not now. She re-examined everything through the lens of Bruno's scars. The attack, the way Ace had been marked and dumped to die. She reached out to a contact she hadn't spoken to in years. Lyle Hastings, an ex-federal canine handler who now ran a non-profit for retraining retired service dogs. She sent him a few discreet photos of Bruno's stance, behavior patterns, the specific drills he had been performing with Ace. 20 minutes later, he called. "That dog of yours isn't just trained. He's special ops trained. You're looking at what we called a Tier 2 clearance canine designed for covert search, scent differentiation, and live witness recovery. But we only had 6 of those units nationwide. Most were decommissioned after 2017. Where the hell did he come from?" Amara's breath caught. "New before it burned." Lyle went dead silent. Then he said, "Impossible. That fire wasn't just arson, it was cleanup. The place was a front for off-the-books experimentation, using enhanced trauma conditioning for accelerated obedience. Every dog in that camp was registered under fake names. When it burned, they said no survivors." "You're telling me he walked out?" Amara's voice was low. "He didn't just walk out, Lyle, he came back with proof." She turned toward Ace, who had perked up at the sound of her voice. He tilted his head, his ears alert, his eyes watching her with the focused intensity of a soldier waiting instruction. Amara pulled the chip reader from her drawer and gently clipped the scanning probe to Ace's collar. She hadn't done a full scan since the first check-in weeks ago. She assumed everything had been read already, but the previous vet had only accessed the top-level data registration tags. Breed info, falsified medical records. She dove deeper into the storage partition and found an encrypted subfolder labeled DS9A/Alpha. It shouldn't have been there. Companion chips didn't hold subdirections. She hesitated, then bypassed the encryption with a coda hedgehog from her old investigation days. What emerged was a 5-minute audio file. At first, nothing but static. Then a voice. Male, calm, almost bored. "They're getting too smart. This one kept hiding the runt. Took us 3 hours to dig it out. Don't worry, I marked them both, one for retrieval, the other for disposal. They won't make it through the week." Amara's blood froze. Another voice joined in. Younger, more agitated. The first man chuckled. "Doesn't matter. The chip scrambles everything. No one's ever pulling this out unless they know where to look." Ace shifted at her feet, as if he recognized the cadence. Amara sat in stunned silence as the audio continued. The rest was casual. Fragments of cruelty passed between professionals like coffee shop banter. "Got another buyer in Dubai for the control prototype. She want the fear agent ones or the responder's fear. Easier to parade." A final line before static swallowed it all. "Burn the files. We'll blame it on the activists again." Amara's hands trembled. Her pulse roared in her ears. This wasn't just abuse. This was systemic, organized, and covered up by people who believed they were untouchable. She glanced at Ace, whose entire body had gone still. She whispered, "You weren't supposed to survive." The chip had been meant as a marker, a grave. But by some impossible series of choices, Bruno's escape, his training, the storm of memory that led them here, it had become something else. A key, a voice from the grave speaking through the most unexpected witness. Amara knew what she had to do. She backed up the file, uploaded it to an encrypted server, and sent a ping to 2 trusted contacts, a whistleblower attorney in DC and a documentary editor in Portland. Neither would ask questions. They had been waiting for her to return to this story for years. She stood, grabbed her coat, and walked to the fire. Bruno stirred. His eyes met hers. She knelt beside him and laid a gentle hand over his side. "You brought him back," she whispered. "You brought the truth back. And now it was time to finish what he started." The courtroom was colder than Amara expected. Not in temperature, but in tone. The sterile hum of white lights overhead matched only by the dead-ass stares of the state officials seated behind polished oak desks. The Department of Agriculture had agreed to the hearing on short notice only because of the leaked audio file. Amara's encrypted message had somehow bypassed the bureaucracy and landed directly in the inbox of a sympathetic investigator. Willing to stick his neck out, now here she was, back in a city she'd long since left behind, in a tailored black jacket that didn't feel like hers. With Ace sitting obediently at her feet, Bruno still recovering back at the cabin under watch from Dr. Morell. The judge's gavel opened the hearing at 10:00 a.m. sharp, and the chairs creaked as a small audience settled in a few journalists, some legal observers, and a smattering of government liaisons with faces carved from stone. Amara stood when called, voice steady despite the storm beneath her ribs, as she laid out the findings in clear, clinical language. The chip, the audio, the chain of abuse stretching across state lines, and the connection to the New Corinth facility whose incineration had once buried every lead she'd chased. Across the aisle, the defense table remained quiet until the lead attorney stood. His suit was immaculate, his face older than she remembered but unmistakable. Elliot Varn, the same man who had pulled her credentials 4 years ago, had reviewed her footage with cold detachment and told her to stop chasing ghosts and focus on stories that won't ruin your career. She felt her throat go dry, bile clawing behind her words, but she didn't flinch. Elliot adjusted his tie and smiled a courtroom smile, flat, professional, insincere. "Miss Lewis," he said, "surely you understand that unverified chip recordings are inadmissible unless corroborated by certified tech analysis. Your connection to this case is emotional, not evidentiary. You found a stray. That doesn't prove a conspiracy." The word stray made Ace's ears flat. Amara looked down, hand grazing his shoulder, grounding both of them. She opened her laptop and played the audio for the room, letting the file speak in static-laced horror for itself. The judge shifted. The gallery went still. Elliot didn't blink. "You'll need more than words," he said. "Show me physical proof." Amara clenched her jaw. That was the trap. They had torched everything. That was the point. Bruno's wound, Ace's trauma, the digital trail, it was all traceable, but not physical enough to unsee the corporate protection funding this operation from behind layers of shell organizations. She sat, fingers tapping her notes in frustration, when suddenly, without warning, Ace stood. Not abruptly, not in panic. He rose with purpose, ears erect, eyes fixed on the far wall of the courtroom. Then he tilted his head back and let out a sound Amara had never heard from him before. A howl, long, low, law-modulated. 3 short tones followed by one long, a canine emergency signal. The room froze. Amara's breath caught. Ace stepped forward and barked once, sharp and direct, toward the courtroom doors. Then they opened. Bruno. He walked in slow, still favoring his shoulder, but his posture unyielding. Around his neck hung a ragged leather collar Amara had never seen before, and clipped to it, swinging gently with each step, was a chain, rusted, cracked, and at its center, embedded in the leather, was a chipped, blood-stained tracking capsule. Bruno padded forward to Amara and dropped the collar at her feet. The room erupted. The judge slammed the gavel, demanding order. Elliot stepped back, visibly rattled. Amara knelt, her fingers trembling as she lifted the collar. The chain was broken, likely torn from its mount. Inside the capsule was dried blood, and beneath it, a serial number engraved in steel. She recognized the prefix. It matched the black site ID from New Corinth. The chip had survived. More than that, it had been removed manually, then hidden. Bruno had carried it all this time. Inside his collar, Amara stood and handed the item to the forensic specialist, who immediately scanned it. The courtroom fell into an almost sacred silence as the scanner pinged and the display lit up. A match not just to the New Corinth database, to a list of missing dogs officially recorded as euthanized 3 days before the fire. False death reports, fabricated closures. This wasn't negligence, it was premeditated erasure. Amara turned toward Elliot, whose expression had gone sheet white. She took a slow breath. "You wanted physical proof?" she said. Ace stepped beside her, tail still, eyes locked. Across the room, someone gasped. Another reporter raised a hand to capture a photo. Bruno stood unmoving, like a monument to everything that had been buried. The judge leaned forward, voice lower now. "We will recess for verification and reconvene with a recommendation for federal inquiry." Outside, the clouds broke open, letting sunlight fracture through the glass like gold spilled across steel. Amara turned toward the doors, her dogs at her side. Behind her, the courtroom murmured, but the storm was not over. Spring arrived not with a thunderclap or sudden bloom, but gently, like breath returning to lungs that had held still through the longest winter. The snow had vanished from the mountain's face, revealing mossy stones and dirt trails dotted with the first purple wildflowers of the season. The air was warmer now, less like glass and more like silk, wrapping gently around the trees and whispering through the cabin's open windows. A week had passed since the courtroom had gone still under the weight of Bruno's final evidence. The chip inside the rusted collar had carried far more than a serial number. It contained a sequence of time schedule, a manifest of over 30 canines, marked for international export under fabricated identities, and encrypted communications between handlers and higher-level contact. Those files, once decrypted and verified by federal agents, led to a coordinated raid across 4 states and 2 port warehouses. Arrests had been made, a name had been exposed, a senator's donor connection severed, a foundation shut down, and through it all, the name Bruno had begun to appear in whispered conversations across the agency, spoken with equal parts disbelief and awe. A dog that had vanished, a dog that had survived, a dog that had come back. Amara didn't care for the headlines. She had declined every interview. All she wanted was to go home. Back at the cabin, life unfolded in quieter ways. Ace had grown stronger, taller, more certain of his body. He no longer limped unless he ran too fast. He responded to voice commands Amara hadn't taught him. And every morning he waited for Bruno by the door, nose pressed to the glass, ears perked, tail silk. His fur had lost some of its shine and his left side stiffened in the mornings, but his eyes remained as sharp as ever. Marakia often found the two of them in the clearing at sunrise, Ace circling the edge as Bruno watched, correcting posture with a low huff or a sharp glance. Their sessions had changed less about drills, more about presence, intention, awareness. One afternoon, as Amara sat on the porch writing field notes she knew she'd never publish, Bruno limped over to Ace and placed a paw gently on the younger dog's shoulder. Then he stepped back, barked once, and laid down, nose between paws. Ace stood still, confused, then turned and began pacing the outer ring of the cabin's clearing, pausing every few feet to glance back. Amara realized what was happening. Bruno was giving the final command, the final test. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and cast the world in a golden hush, Amara carried a blanket to the grassy slope beside the stream where the forest opened wide. Bruno lay there already, breathing slow, the air around him fragrant with spring and damp earth. Ace lay close but still, head resting on his paws, tail flicking occasionally with the kind of patience Amara had come to recognize as reverence. She sat beside Bruno, placed the blanket gently beneath his side, and whispered, "I think he's ready." Bruno didn't lift his head. He didn't need to. His ears twitched once in acknowledgement. His chest rose, fell, rose again, slower. Amara placed a hand on his side, feeling the warmth beneath his fur. The rhythm that had once driven him through storms, through fire, woods thick with hunters and shadows. That rhythm was fading, but it hadn't failed. It had fulfilled. The sky above stretched wide and endless, painted in the pinks and deep oranges only mountain sunsets could master. The wind stirred the grass gently, brushing past her fingers like a goodbye. Bruno lifted his head once and looked up, not at her, not at Ace, but at the sky. His eyes reflected something vast, something ancient, something peaceful. Amara leaned down, her forehead resting against his. Eyes closed, heart open. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "You brought him home. You brought the truth home." Bruno exhaled, one final breath, and then he stilled. Ace didn't move for a long time. When he finally did, he stood, walked to Amara's side, and pressed his head into her ribs. She wrapped her arm around him and let the quiet settle. No sirens, no gavel, no headlines. Just sky, just trees, just the echo of loyalty that stretched further than words. Deeper than fear, stronger than any war she'd ever fought. They buried Bruno beneath the tallest pine near the edge of the clearing, where the morning light hit first and the wind sang low between the branches. No stone, Just a circle of river rocks and the old leather collar, cleaned of blood, hung gently from a carved wooden stake. Ace sat beside the grave every morning for a week, tail wrapped around his paws, eyes steady on the forest beyond. Then one morning, without prompting, he stood, circled the cabin, and a signal, a beginning. Amara watched from the porch, tears blurring the mountain line in the distance, and whispered to the wind, "I'll carry the rest." And the wind, warm and new, carried it back. If this story moved you even a little, don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter. I'm curious what part hit you the hardest, and where in the world are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, I'd love to know.